Eating a meal aboard a train is probably the best luxury you can get. The excellent service, the great food and drink, and the interchanging scenery as you go about your journey with the steam train chugging along in front is wonderful, and people pay top dollar for this service. Whether it is a free-course dinner or an afternoon cream tea, it's something I could recommend everyone should try at least once. In the early days of long-haul travel between London and Edinburgh, there was no such luxury on board. With the journey taking upwards of 8 to 10 hours, if not longer, many people would pack picnics for the trip. However, this would hardly sustain people for the day, so the trip was broken up with a good stop in York. The masses would escape the carriage and head out to the restaurants. Only thing is, this stop was only a respite of about 20 minutes or so, and with hundreds of people thinking and wanting the exact same thing, it put a strain on everybody and everything, and it was hardly good manners to try and scarf down your entire lunch before trying to climb back on board again. By the 1870s, little had been done to accommodate any form in development in passenger amenities. While the world improved on many things such as sanitation, better food, better living accommodations, you'd be lucky to find as much as heating on your train. The train companies recognised this for longer haul travel, so opted to include rest stops for weary passengers. York was a big forerunner and was a very popular stop. Its cavernous station and string of amenities meant that it could accommodate a lot of people all at once, and it sat handily about halfway between London and Edinburgh. Passengers, though, simply found the stops not long enough, with some even risking their own lives by jumping off the train at a random station and trying to get aboard again minutes later with food in hand. In the days before electric locks, this was highly dangerous and led to people getting dragged along while holding the door, or worse. Another option is to purchase a luncheon ticket. These were baskets picked up at the starting station and contained a basic pre-packed lunch. It wasn't anything flashy, but it was enough for a decent meal. The first ever semblance of a dining train was not born in the UK, but in the United States. At first, the practice of stopping for rest stops was universally adopted, but thanks to Pullman's new carriages, they found to be much more stable and a nice smoother ride. It was so smooth that Pullman developed the first sleeping cars. But as the services proved popular, the rest stops were becoming an inconvenience. In 1868, Pullman developed the first ever dining car, and the idea of having meals prepared and served on board the train spread like wildfire. The idea was brought to the UK, where the Midland Railway took the idea on board with relish and worked with Pullman in a harmonious partnership. In 1874, the first train was ready, and a whole host of dignitaries and the press were brought aboard to take the train from St Pancras to Bedford. There was no kitchen of any kind, and the meal would have been what you would expect from the luncheon tickets, only a little fancier. But the train proved that eating aboard was possible. It was possible, but surprisingly not that popular. People were enamoured with the compartment seating, and amazingly, the idea was scrapped. The dining train, which was then converted into a sleeper car, was reconverted back to its original design, and it took 5 more years to convince people that eating on board was a good idea. By that time, the pesky problem of not having a kitchen had been solved. In 1879, the first regular dining service was introduced. The Pullman car, the Prince of Wales, started daily operation between Leeds and King's Cross. It had been rebuilt into a dining car and had a kitchen at one end and seating for about 10 passengers in another, with a smoking room for an additional 9. The food was prepared on a coal-burning range, and a series of electronic bells were installed near the tables so the passengers could call the steward if they require. The car was not interconnecting, so the passengers that were eating would have to sit in the car for the entire journey. It was okay, and the first-class passengers found the car interesting. But the dining experience did not spark any mad rush to introduce dining trains to services. But like a slow burn, slowly the Pullman coaches started to encroach. At first, a dining service was only put on trains with a 5-hour or more journey time, but started to improve. Dining trains finally began to show their real promise and what they could offer in 1881 with an all-exclusive Pullman train from London to Brighton. Even though the journey time was nowhere near the 5 hours normal running time for a dinner, the train screamed everything luxury and opulent and showed what a dining experience could really be. A year later, the first interconnecting coaches were produced. These coaches still had separate enclosed compartments, but now had an internal corridor linking them and a toilet on the end. More improvements followed, following heating and even foot warmers. The introduction of the dining car meant that for the customers, the long-standing rush for those tedious rest stops were now a thing of the past, and they didn't have to rush over meals, and it was possible to order several courses. By 1898, the third class had the option to order meals, and although it was nothing like first class, it was suitable and filling to the travellers. By the turn of the 20th century, eating on the go had been firmly established, and it was considered as normal as buying lunch on a station platform. The stations were not too happy about losing their rest stop passengers, but the increasing number of people using the railways made up any shortfall. With the lack of rebooking, however, this meant that the railways had a rather large problem with food wastage. Sometimes, if the passengers' numbers were less than predicted, the food was passed onto the station platforms and to sell in the cafes. In the days where refrigeration was in its infancy, it's no wonder that the station food had a questionable reputation. In the years preceding World War I, there became two distinct variations to the dining experiences. Many associated the term dining car as eating for dinner, while restaurant car was able to get anything they needed at any time. With this in mind, the Great Western introduced the first ever buffet cars. These were perfect for passengers just wanting a cup of tea or a small snack without having to sit down in any formal setting. The buffet car was open to all. For the masses it was great, but for the social elite, they hated them as they were forced to mingle with the commoners. While the dining trains took a back seat during the war, it remained unchanged for many years even after the grouping. Rivals suddenly merged and their dining services were massively increased. The LNER brought in several new high-speed trains using Gresley's newest Pacific streamlined locomotives. These engines were built for speed and the coaches were redesigned to be lighter and were finished with the Art Deco designs that were popular at the time. The Silver Jubilee train of 1935 had a triplet dining facility, while the Coronation trains brought back open dining in the classist views of the elites was eroding and views were being broadened. Unlike the end of the First World War, the end of the Second World War had changed the dining habits for the majority of the public. Gone were the days of fine dining and multi-course meals. During the war, people who had been used to eating off silver were now queuing up for soup ladles in line and quick bites to eat. After the war, the demand for fast food had become a habit, and food was becoming a less elegant affair. By 1949, after British Rail took over, they knew the importance of dining trains, but the stock they had was outdated for the time, and after several attempts to revive the services, they were forced to modify the coaches they had for the differing market. Using LMS stock, they modified the kitchen cars to be smaller and have a self-service vibe. Passengers could pick up a tray and select what they pleased and then take the tray to the allocated seating. There was also a cold store aboard with ready meals so passengers could have hot meals on the go, ready in just a few minutes thanks to a gas stove in the kitchen. It meant less porters for British Rail, less workers needed to wait on the people and meeting the passengers' demands. Of course, there was still a need for formal meals and British Rail were able to offer this. After the rationing of meat was finally over, it became easier to offer the full formal meal, but things were never the same as before. The kitchen cars offered the same sit-down course meals, but now there was a supplementary buffet for those on the go. An adjoining saloon was normally attached for seating for passengers not wishing to go back to their seats for food and tea. British Rail wanted to maximise on the buffet quick meal train further and brought in the mini buffet. This was similar to the others, but this only offered light snacks with the option of hot and cold drinks. This was ideal on smaller journeys and only needed to be operated by one person. They also brought in the griddle buffet car. Similar to the mini buffet car, it had, as the name implied, a griddle for cooking hot snacks, burgers and sandwiches. In the mid to late 50s, the move to innovate had become a core factor. More and more diesel and electric routes were being brought in, and a stronger, more powerful locomotives replaced the streamlined, yet now outdated Kings of Steam. Coaches were now physically larger and faster speeds were permitted, even allowing engines to go over the ton. Coaches were not just confined to one route either, some finding themselves from King's Cross to Leeds, then to York, then to Aberdeen. With the coaches moving around, the concept of dining had to be thought of. There was no good having a mini buffet if the train was going long distance, for example, and sometimes the journey was too short for multi-course meals. Pullmans were still on the fleet, but now they were confined to fewer routes, and the British side of the company were taken over by British Transport Commission in 1954. By 1970s, they were slowly being withdrawn. By 1976, high-speed trains were being brought onto the scene. Longer Mac-free coaches were introduced. These were lighter, perfect for the new Intercity 125. The 125 was the first train to include no separate supplements to use the buffet. The 125s were BR's renaissance, and people flocked to the trains. As well as the basic buffet, the 125 could service simple hot meals, but had more seating for longer journeys. They also brought back the trolley service, something that had been phased in and out throughout the years. In 1994, under the Railways Act of the previous year, the UK network began to be privatised and away from government control. With every sale, British Rail became weaker and weaker. Individual companies began to select their own catering facilities and services. Today, there are 11 companies that offer catering on board. The majority offer a simple trolley buffet service. While some do have full meals in first class, the majority offer light bites, sandwiches, crisps, fruit and snacks. There is hot food, usually in the form of sandwiches, brought to your table. At the National Railway Museum, you will find many relics of the dining era. There are hundreds of examples of silverware and plates that you would regularly find on board, and even a dining car from the Flying Scotsman train itself. One particular item you may see is this. This little box was the packaging for the last ever microwave cheeseburger on the GNR sold in 1999. It was a bit of a PR stunt, as it was to announce the new deli burger, and they did bring back the burger a few years after they went bust, but for some reason, seeing this in its smart display box in a museum dedicated to the Kings of Steam amuses me. I have no idea why. Maybe because it's silverware and glittering surround it. Maybe it's a sign to show just how far dining trains have really come.